All right, just a few ground rules before we get started with the questions, some important information. If you're interested in asking a question, we have a line forming right here. You'll see this gentleman raising his hand. Please form a line behind him. When it's your turn to ask your question, you can come up here and stand on this yellow X. There's only one question allowed per person, no follow-up questions. Please remember to frame your question in the form of a question, and I will hold the microphone.
Okay, and I do have one rule, which is that if you disagree with me on any topic, raise your hand and go to the front of the line. Perfect. Well, number one, thank you for coming, even though you disagree. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm a longtime fan of yours, Ben, so it's the first time I get to see you in public, but that doesn't mean that I agree with you on everything. So, my question, I just let you hold that up. Last year, 2017, May, you posted an article in which you talked about isolationism a little bit. In isolationism, you said, let me just go ahead and read this really quick. President Bush embraced interventionism and stretched us too far. I agree with that statement. President Obama embraced isolationism and watched the region burst into flame. My question is, given that, given that in 2015 there were 800 plus military bases in over 70 countries in 2015, the United States initiated operations in 2014 against ISIS, and is otherwise heavily involved in the entire world's geopolitics, how can you possibly say that President Obama is an isolationist?
So you're right that it's an overstatement in the sense that a full isolationist would be somebody who brings all of our troops home. But in terms of relative American involvement in political matters outside of Libya, where he was obviously an interventionist, he was tended toward isolationism. Now, being in the presidency tends to make isolationists into war hawks, as we've seen with President Trump, who I think has a tendency to on a spiritual level, be more of an isolationist. The reason that I said that is I was specifically talking, if I recall in the article, about the Middle East situation, in which President Obama basically went hands-off with regard to the Arab Spring. He withdrew troops in the middle of from Iraq, which led to the rise of ISIS in the first place. He delegated out the situation in Syria to Vladimir Putin and the Russians, which has worked out to the tune of 700,000 dead, something like that. He has basically delegated power in the region to the Iranians, which is the worst possible solution. So when I say isolationist, I don't necessarily mean just in terms of troop use. I think that you can be an isolationist also in terms of how you approach diplomacy. President Obama was somebody who wanted to minimize America's presence on the world stage and our power on the world stage and our reach on the world stage. I don't think President Trump feels the same way, and I think that that's made for a more solidifying Middle East under President Trump than it did under President Obama.
Hello. So I agree with you on most of your things. I recently watched a video where you were talking about a reporter who let their son go to school wearing a dress.
Yes.
And so for me, I think the main issue when it comes to transgender and people getting confused is not basically where sorry.
It's okay.
So for that boy, if that child knows that he's a boy and he goes to school, I'm not trying to be emotional.
No, it's
fine. And he understands that, and his parents are just like, yeah, just remember you're a boy. I understand the whole bullying thing you were talking about, but wouldn't it confuse the child more if you say, hey, you can't do these things because these are specifically girl things, even though this child who's a boy and realizes he's a boy?
No, if I'll answer the question, then you can tell me whether I'm getting to your question. Okay. So my feeling is that as a parent, and a parent of young kids, that it is my job to educate my kids about life. It is not my job to let my children make autonomous decisions about which they know nothing, because kids are really stupid. And I say this as the father of two. I mean, when I say that my 4.5-year-old daughter is smart, I mean for a 4.5-year-old. I don't mean overall. Because she just doesn't know enough about how the world works. And not only that, the reality is that cultures across time and space have differentiated between the dress of males and females. Now, there are folks who say, well, male dress in American society may look like female dress in some other societies. That's fine, but that's not how it is in the United States, meaning that we all sort of accept that there is a binary dress code, at least to a certain extent, in terms of how boys and girls dress. And if you want to confuse your child, then the best thing to do is take a 6-year-old kid and say to them, yeah, go ahead and wear a dress to school. And I don't feel like I'm discriminating against my 2.5-year-old son when I offer him another option or when I encourage him to take that other option. So, for example, my 2.5-year-old son, he's got an older sister, and his older sister wears all sorts of frilly things, and they're very shiny and they're very sparkly. And so he's very fond of going into her closet and taking out her shoes and putting them on. Okay, and after him doing this for a little while, I said to him, no, you're not allowed to wear those shoes. Those are your sister's shoes. Those are girl things. This is not evil. This is not terrible. This is called being a parent. And when finally, after he did it a little bit, I said to him, why don't we, you know what? I'm going to take you out. We're going to get you new shoes. We went to the Cowboy Western store, and we got him boots. He will not take off his boots. The moral of the story is that kids like cool stuff, regardless of whether it is stereotyped male or female, and that it is not a terrible thing to reinforce certain cultural stereotypes that are going to make your kid happier, safer, and more comfortable. And confusing them about gender is not just, let's say that you are the world's most open-minded parent. You say, listen, I don't want to be part of any of these dress stereotypes with regard to culture. Guess what? Your kid still lives in a world. Your kid still lives in a world full of other people who are trying to reinforce the fact that masculinity and femininity have different qualities, and those qualities and differences are beautiful. Okay? And so when we say to parents that you're doing something wrong, if you say to your 6-year-old that he can't wear a dress to school, all I'm thinking is, you don't get to tell me how to raise my kid, particularly when, I promise you, it is a better pathway to screwing up your kid as a general statistical matter by telling them that they can dress as a member of the opposite sex when they are 6 years old, than telling them, you know what, why don't you not do that today and instead put on a pair of pants.
Hey, Ben. Thank you for coming out, and I just wanted to say that I'm a really big fan of your podcast. I listen to it on a somewhat regular basis on SoundCloud. So the question I had for you is that with last week, we had the midterm elections, and for Wisconsin, there were a whole bunch of different things that were on that. There were the gubernatorial, the Senate, the Congress, so on and so forth. One of the other things that was specific to Wisconsin was marijuana legalization. There were 16 counties that were up for recreational, medical, and then both. And two of those counties included Milwaukee and Dane, which hosts Madison, Wisconsin. With those two cities being the most populous in the Wisconsin state, do you think that the increased voter turnout was due to a segment of the population that came out specifically for marijuana legalization that would have swung the vote in Tony Evers' favor as compared to those that wouldn't normally come out in the first place?
So I'll admit I don't know enough about local politics in Milwaukee specifically with regard to pot to say yes. I will say that people who are fond of pot are not typically the go-getters who are eager to get to the ballot box. Yeah. Obviously, look, the midterm elections didn't go the way that I would have liked them to go, and I think that was more reflective in Wisconsin of high Democratic turnout across the board. There was very high Democratic turnout across the board, particularly in contested areas. They actually did vote at higher rates in contested areas, which suggests that money spent in contested races by Democrats was actually highly effective. And it does, I have a lot of thoughts about the 2018 election and what it bodes for 2020. All I would say is that the level of sanguinity that I see from a lot of Republicans about President Trump's election in 2016 is unjustified by the election of 2018.
Hello, Mr. Shapiro. Let's just get this right. I do believe that abortion is completely wrong. Get that straight. But don't you feel that there should be at least some legal standards so that we don't have people, doing it illegally, like not jumping off staircases or anything like that?
Well, I'm not sure what law we have in any realm of American life where we ban something that we believe is protection of human life, and then we somehow have a cure-all when it comes to bad after effect. It's sort of a weird idea that you can prevent people from breaking the law that you've already created to have them not do it, right? And we can have them do it in the safest possible way. I can't say, it's sort of like having, you've made crystal meth illegal, but we're going to make sure that you have a clean spoon to use every time you use crystal meth. It's difficult to kind of reconcile those two ideas. As far as the safety of abortion, as I've always said, and virtually every pro-lifer believes, there are exceptions in the case of the life of the mother. Right? There are very few pro-lifers who don't believe in an exception in the case in which the life of the mother is endangered, although those cases are extraordinarily rare, medically speaking. But as far as the idea that you can protect people from the consequences of their own decisions, I don't think that you can do that, especially after you've already banned them from exactly the sort of conduct that you're trying to ban them from in what you're talking about.
Hey, Ben, how are you doing today?
Well, how are you?
My name's John. I'm a liberal, but I like your podcast.
Well, thank you for coming, first of all, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
You and Sam Harris talk a lot about religion, and he recently made comments about him believing that America is closer to a theocracy than people realize. After Matt Whitaker's comments about the new Supreme Court, or whatever Supreme Court justice should have biblical leanings, do you think Sam Harris' comments about the United States being closer to a theocracy holds any weight?
I mean, I think that Sam sees theocracy behind every rock and tree. But I really like Sam, and I'm friends with Sam. But the idea that we are on the verge of theocracy in the United States is asinine. I mean, this is not The Handmaid's Tale, as much as Mike Pence might want it to be. No, but this is not The Handmaid's Tale. We are not on the verge of The Handmaid's Tale. Anybody who believes that we are on the verge of The Handmaid's Tale is out of their mind. As far as the idea, like in which area, when you say that we want somebody to have biblical leanings, the truth is that I would like a lot of people in the United States to carry what I consider to be traditional Judeo-Christian values. I think that's an important thing because I think that the Enlightenment itself is rooted in those values. I had this conversation specifically with Sam for an hour on the Sunday Special when we discussed the roots of the Enlightenment. One of the big mistakes I think a lot of kind of neo-Enlightenment thinkers like Sam or Steven Pinker like to make, I think it's a big mistake that they like to make, is they sort of suggest that the Enlightenment sprang out of nowhere. Suddenly reason, yay! And it was great. It was the end of the 18th century, and suddenly everybody realized that reason was awesome and religion sucked, and then everything was great for 200 years. First of all, everything was not so great for the following 200 years. I mean, there's a record number of people killed in that 200-year period. But beyond that, the truths and goods of the Enlightenment came about in a specific time and place. They didn't come up in China, they didn't come up in India, they didn't come up in South America. They came out in Western civilization, a civilization that was predicated on certain principles about truth, order in the universe, the religious obligation to investigate that universe, and that has a 2,000-year history before the Enlightenment, a 3,000-year history if you go back to Sinai, before the Enlightenment. And so the idea that reason and theology are in direct conflict is, I think, ahistorical, and not only ahistorical, I think that it's flat out afactual. And the fact is that an enormous amount of scientific progress was made before even the Enlightenment. Many of the members of the Enlightenment who were scientific scholars were themselves deists. They were at least believer in a higher power. And many of the people before that were actively working with the Catholic Church. Gregory Mendel was a monk. Right? There's a priest. There's too much scientific progress that was made over the course of centuries prior to that, specifically because of the sort of Maimonidean and Thomas Aquinas belief that God speaks in two languages, the language of the Bible and the language of science. And if you read the Bible to obliterate science, you're reading the Bible wrong. So, I think Sam's version of what religion is a pretty rudimentary version of what religion is, and this speaks to somebody who is religious and takes religion extraordinarily seriously and studies it every day. But are we close to a theocracy because Matt Whitaker said he wants a biblical-leaning judge? Like, does Matt Whitaker want the guy to get up there and, I don't know, smite people? Like, I don't know what that means. And I don't know why Matt Whitaker's opinion would matter anyway. He's not an elected senator. He wasn't even confirmed by the Senate. So, Matt Whitaker saying stuff is the acting attorney general for 5 minutes before he's replaced. That does not speak to me. Donald Trump's president of the United States. Isn't it a theocracy? Okay? That dude, let's put it this way. Judeo-Christian standards of sexual morality do not apply. Right? So, I have a hard time believing that. Like, if there is going to be a theocracy, I think it's the theocracy of a radical left that believes that facts are no longer of essence, and that we ought to be able to override those in the name of secular religion. That's what I'm more afraid of. I'm not afraid of a bunch of Bible thumpers coming down the street. Listen, as a Jew, there hasn't been a great history with people who come after us with the Bible. I am as a Jew, I'm also significantly less afraid of evangelicals than pretty much anyone else in the United States at this point. And I don't see the great threat to the United States coming from a bunch of people who go to Bible study sessions on Sundays. I just don't.
Hey, Ben. So you've talked about before your great disagreements with the public education system, which I also totally agree with. You've also talked about how one of the few social sectors you actually agree with is the mental health sector, correct?
Yes.
So one of the things I was kind of asking you, I'm kind of interested in knowing your opinion on, is would you be more appropriate with sort of a hybrid between them? So, for example, I am autistic and I've received intensive ABA therapy that would not have been able to have been done except for massive aid from the government. So I was more or less interested, would you agree with a sort of educational aspect of mental illness when it comes to expanding it? Also, if you have the time, would you be willing to sign my copy of the Communist Manifesto so I can send some very interesting messages back at home?
Yeah, I mean, you can bring it right here and I'll sign it for you real fast. I will make you read the inscription out loud now.
This book sucks by Ben Shapiro.
So as to your question about public resources and educational resources, so my preferred, this is always my preferred hierarchy when it comes to help. Preferred hierarchy goes family, then local community, for me religious community, then local non-religious community, then local government, then state government, then federal government. I think that in the United States we go straight to federal government almost all the time, and it's almost always a mistake. I also think that when it comes to, and that holds true for mental illness as well, there is a group of people who are going to fall through the cracks, and it seems to me that no civilized country can allow people to completely fall through the cracks if nobody else is going to pick up the slack, but we have to be very careful that the social system that seeks to help doesn't actually crowd out all of the voluntary public good that is being done by charitable organizations. As far as the case of autism, for example, insofar as you actually need help in order to get ahead, I don't see a problem with, again, that hierarchy being utilized. Again, I would prefer that we start at the bottom of the hierarchy before we reach the top of the hierarchy.
Hi, Ben.
Hey.
Yeah, I'm talking to you about the policy you had talked about with discrimination 1, discrimination 2.
Yes.
With, like, people talking about like going after the best available data and making assumptions about like people based off of that. Would you not say that that's a policy of, like, I'm asking, isn't that basically a policy of racism, talking about like taking people down just based on their skin, even with no background knowledge of who they are?
So what I'm saying is that it is a form of discrimination, but it is not tantamount to biological racism. In other words, biological racism would suggest that regardless of what I know about you and your background, based on the color of your skin, I won't hire you. What I'm saying is that if I have no data other than your group membership, and it doesn't have to be race-based, it could be sex-based, it could be religious-based. If all I have is a piece of data, and that's all I know, and I've been banned by the government from seeing anything else, as in the case that I was mentioning, then people are going to make decisions based on that lack of data that look like discrimination, that look like racism, and that aren't actually racism. They are the use of the best available data. Now, that can be alleviated, as I say, by attention to individuals and the data about that individual. So the solution to that would be that in a free market system, people would then interview you. They'd find out as much information about you as possible, and they would judge you as an individual without respect to any group membership. But in the absence of any additional data, people do tend to jump to conclusions about individuals based on whatever information is available. And that's not unreasonable, because we do it all the time in a variety of settings. It just sounds more malevolent, obviously, when it's based on group membership in a racial group. But the way to alleviate that, we all want to fight that, right? The way to alleviate that is to allow as much deep dive into individual data as humanly possible so we can make a decision based on you as an individual and not you based on you as a group member, right? I'm sort of making the same argument that, like, affirmative action isn't necessarily outright racism, except that we do have better data available. So, for example, let's say that affirmative action, which is sort of the reverse policy, affirmative action makes an assumption. The assumption is that if you're black in the United States, that you are therefore poorer in the United States or have a poorer educational background in the United States, and therefore you deserve a leg up when it comes to admissions. Now, that wouldn't be racist if all the information we had was just your race, right? It would be racist if we have a bunch of other information suggestive of your background, your academic performance, and all the rest. Then we're using race in place of data. But if we're not using race in place of other better data, then it's not actually racism, it's just discrimination that makes us uncomfortable because we need more data.
Good evening, Mr. Shapiro. I'm a first-generation immigrant from Nicaragua. It's the founder of an organization called Myth Informed, where we promote viewpoint diversity to limit the effects of authoritarianism. And we've also have a yearly event called MythCon at the PAPS, for instance, where we've brought a number of commentators, YouTubers, Blair White was one of them, both from the left and the right. If you're seeing that at colleges we're becoming too politically correct, censorious, or they've abandoned free speech, do you see a place for the private sector to play a part to help bridge the divide or to help depolarize the nation? And if so, would you be interested in our event in LA with a startup company that promotes free speech?
Well, as I say, we're always willing to take anybody who is who's willing to make an application. As far as private companies doing this sort of thing, obviously I run a private company and I am deeply involved with having debates with folks on the other side of the aisle, so I'm very much in favor of that. As far as the censorious nature of college, I'm more afraid for students on college campuses who have to be here day in and day out than I'm afraid for speakers like me, because I think that the right has successfully said to college campuses that you actually need to allow speakers to come in and speak without shutting it down. Right, and that was, specifically in Wisconsin, this was actually the case, right? Last time I was in Wisconsin, there were a bunch of protesters who delayed the speech by 20 minutes, 25 minutes. They were screaming and yelling, and the Wisconsin state legislature actually passed a bill based on that to help guarantee academic freedom for guest speakers like me. What I'm more worried about in terms of censorship is crackdowns on particular political point of view, social ostracization on campus based on lack of understanding of another political point of view, all of which, I hope can be alleviated both publicly and privately.
This will be our final question for the evening.
Hi, Ben. You talk about Christianity and Judaism a lot together.
Yes.
And the benefits of them both. So I'm curious, the main difference is obviously who they say Jesus was. So who would you say he was, and how could what you would say is a lie be something so beneficial and be something that you promote often?
Okay, so to be fair, I've never said that I think that Christians are lying about anything. I think that they truly believe what they believe, and I truly believe what I believe. So I've never said that Christians are lying about anything, nor have I said that the Gospels are, a lie in the sense that people were consciously lying about things when they wrote them. What I will say is that the Judaic perspective on Jesus is the idea of a Christian Messiah is very foreign to Judaism. Judaism doesn't believe that the Messiah was ever going to be an incarnation of the divine. The Jewish Messiah is a political figure who was a normal human being who was going to fulfill certain goals, including the reestablishment of the temple, the overthrow of foreign adversaries inside the Holy Land, for example. That's a very different view than what is promulgated by the Gospels themselves. As far as the idea, why can Christianity push values that are common to Christianity and Judaism? Because you don't actually have to agree with everything that I say in order to agree with me on a lot of stuff. And the same thing is true between Christianity and Judaism. We do share at least the first half of the book. Right. Well, then it's just a question of where we file the second half, right? You guys put it in the nonfiction section, I don't. So it's but that's it. But as far as the central values, it was Jesus himself who said he came not to change a jot or tittle of the law. So Jesus didn't, even the Gospels, he's not saying that his job was to overthrow the main messages of the Old Testament. It was to complete the law, even according to the New Testament itself, right? It wasn't to abrogate the validity of the Old Testament. It was to go further or to make more complete. That's the Christian perspective. So from a Jewish perspective, that can be quite a good thing over the long haul, right? Maimonides suggests, actually, that Christianity, and he also says Islam actually, were effective at spreading monotheism in a way that Judaism simply was not, factually speaking. And I think that Christian values, based as they are on that same original book, Christianity has been able to promulgate a set of values that has made the world a richer, better, freer place. Oh, sure, that's fine. Simpsons lesson.
So, what would you say is the worst character flaw? Having the moral compass of a Clinton, the looks of a potato, or the IQ of a rotten vegetable?
Well, I mean, I always think that moral lack is the thing that you can't overcome, right? I mean, people, like, you're not responsible for your own intelligence level. You're born with it. You're not born with you're born with your own set of looks, unless you just decide to wildly do something wrong. But you know, in reality, as sort of the central message of everything that I say is that you are individually responsible for your own actions insofar as you have freedom to pursue those actions. Moral virtue is the only thing in the end that really matters. And if you blow your own moral virtue for any reason whatsoever, that one's on you and it's on nobody else. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.